All right, we have reached the end of chapter 17, so we just have a little bit to wrap up here with what was happening in the 1930s. As a whole, this period of time, science was progressing, life was getting easier, but people were starting to realize that wealth and possessions didn't satisfy. So there were great scientific leaps during this time period. So two very important scientists that lived during this time were Pierre and Marie Curie. You need to know what they did. They pioneered radioactive matter and found out that radioactive elements could be reduced to simpler elements. Pierre and Marie Curie pioneered radioactive matter. Pierre and Marie Curie pioneered radioactive matter. The other one you've probably heard of before is Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein did research in the relationship between matter and energy. He created the theory of relativity and he discovered black holes. So Einstein, relationship between matter and energy, the theory of relativity, and black holes. Einstein is known as the father of modern physics. Einstein, known as the father of modern physics. Einstein is known as the father of modern physics. Einstein was German and he was Jewish. And during the 1930s, when the Nazi Party took over in Germany, Einstein fled to the United States. During that time, he also wrote a letter to President Franklin D. Roosevelt, explaining to the president that the Germans were working to create an atomic bomb. Because of that, President Roosevelt created the Manhattan Project, which ended up creating the atomic bomb that we used at the end of World War II. Real quickly, we have a special guest. Raja came to say hello to everyone. So there's the kitty, Raja. Well, you got to see Raja's tail. All right, moving on. Science and transforming transportation. By the end of World War I, airplanes had become stronger and faster, and they started to impact transportation because now people were able to start traveling by air. Also, automobiles were improved. They were able to go further. They were becoming cheaper, and so more people were able to purchase automobiles. And because of this, railways were also increasing as well. So the engines on the trains got stronger, they could power heavier things, and trains improved and they became diesel powered, and they began to be the things that moved goods from one state to the next. All right, mass production and mass consumption started happening during this time period of the 1920s and into the 1930s. Mass production is where, think of a factory where lots of things are made, and they're made very quickly, and it's made in an assembly line type thing. And because of this, more people were able to buy the latest technologies at cheaper prices. Also, credit was increased during this time. Think back to the beginning of the school year when we talked about Dave Ramsey and we talked about credit. Basically, credit is the ability to buy something that you don't have the money for right now and pay it off a little at a time. And this made it so that people were able to buy more stuff. And so, of course, that sounds great, right? So it changed people's lives. Another thing that changed people's lives during this time period is artificial and synthetic materials were created. Basically, man-made products were created and then they were turned into other things. So artificial and synthetic materials became the new raw material for creating things. If you've ever heard of polyester, something that your clothes are sometimes made out of, that is a man-made or a synthetic fabric that is then turned into clothes. So that would be an example. All right, science and art. Well, now we're moving from science to art. During this time, literature changed, and people were looking at the world differently. The themes in literature were misery and gloom, and part of that goes back to what I said at the very beginning. People were starting to realize that money doesn't satisfy, stuff doesn't satisfy, and that is reflected in what they wrote in their books. Another thing that changed was the painting. If you look in your textbook at page 329, you will see two new styles of art that were created. We have expressionism, and that is how the artist feels about his subject is created in the art. So that would be an example of the Scream, which is the picture on the bottom left-hand side of your textbook. Another form of art that was created was Cubism, and that is the picture on the right-hand side of the page. And that's where painters made their subjects into geometric shapes, and that's Cubism. Architecture also advanced during this time period. Skyscrapers were becoming more popular, buildings became more functional, and the goal was also to sort of blend the buildings into their surroundings. Media changed during this time. Paper was super cheap, and so newspapers and magazines became readily available for everyone. And advertisers wanted everyone to see their products, so they would put ads in the newspapers and the magazines. Movies started becoming popular, and going to the movies was a big deal. And also, everyone wanted a radio. The TV hadn't been created yet, but media was delivered through the airwaves to the radios, and listening to the radio became a huge deal and a really important way for people to get their information. The period of the 1930s is often referred to as the Great Depression because of the huge financial collapse that happened in 1929. After World War I, the United States appeared to be doing well economically, but there were a lot of other countries that weren't doing well. During the Great Depression, or during World War I, the United States had loaned money to a whole bunch of its allies. The United States loaned $10 billion to the allied nations, but only one country ended up paying back the United States completely, and that was Finland. Finland, tiny little Finland, was the only country that completely paid back the United States. Finland was the only allied nation that repaid the United States of America after World War I. The United States created something called the Federal Reserve. Now, the Federal Reserve was an organization that was created by Congress to control the money system in the United States and protect the banking system. They set interest rates and they loan money to banks. When they raised interest rates, what that caused an impact on the economy in the United States was there was less financial stability, and it made it hard for businesses to grow because they couldn't borrow money. And this is really what led to the Great Depression. Another thing that happened in this time period was a philosophy called protectionism. And protectionism is the desire to protect American businesses. When the United States wants to protect American businesses, often Congress will pass something called a tariff. And a tariff, you need to know this, you'll need to know it again for next year also. A tariff is a tax on imports. Write it down. A tariff is a tax on imports. A tariff is a tax on imports. So during the 1920s, the Congress passed the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And this would have been a tax on things coming into the United States from other countries. And it ended up backfiring. I want you to look at the box on the page 325. It talks about the Smoot-Hawley tariff. And one of the things that the tariff was on Swiss watches. Swiss watches. Is there really a great demand for them? Probably not so much. But is there a great demand on cars? Absolutely. So what the Swiss people did when their watches were taxed was they, in turn, put a tax on American-made cars, which made it so that people didn't end up buying American-made cars in Switzerland. And this ended up costing the United States a whole bunch of jobs. So now we come into the actual time period of the Great Depression, the 1930s in particular. The US government tried to fix the economy. So what ended up happening that led to the Great Depression? In 1929, the stock market took a huge crash, kind of like what has happened during this time period with the coronavirus and lots of the economy taking a huge tank down. That's kind of what happened in 1929. And when that happened, lots of people lost their jobs and the government tried to step in and spend lots of money to fix the economy, but it didn't work out. In the Great Depression, there were nearly 1/3 of workers that lost their jobs and they looked to the government to fix the problem. But this ended up leading to a growth of government. The government grew, there was billions of dollars in federal spending, and lots of new government programs. I want you to think back to chapter 14. The reason we covered that chapter is because it talked about socialism. And socialism is where the government comes in and starts to try and control the economy. That's exactly what happened during the Great Depression. The time period of the Great Depression led to bigger government and more government involvement in the economy and made it so that we had more socialism, not just in the United States, but in other countries as well. We moved away from capitalism and started moving towards socialism because of the Great Depression. All right, that's all we have for lecture for this week. Make sure you're working on your study guide and good luck on your test this week.